ongoing tradition of Judaism, and understand that these are really difficult issues regardless, because there's so much that is said about it, so many arguments. I would argue all of the arguments that we're having today on this and many other topics have already rinse and repeat happened through the last 2,000 years. Rabbi Langowitz, who Rabbi Mason-Barkin is going to introduce now, is going to help guide us through that. So you have a 4-page sheet. We're probably not going to get through all of the sources, although we might. But I'm really grateful to Rabbi Mason-Barkin for contacting Rabbi Langowitz. I'm so grateful that she's here because this is her area of expertise. Just 2 things. This is not a political rally. I think we can all understand that this is a synagogue. It's a house of God. We're not here to scream and yell at each other. We're here to learn. Learn is the operative word. And number 2 is, I really want, and I think I speak for all of us, for people to have the totality, as much as is possible to do in an hour and a half, of Jewish tradition and thought, again, on a critical bioethical issue such as abortion, which is one way, by the way, one prism of looking at it, before we start engaging in the real stuff. Before we do anything that we do, we should look at what does Judaism say? How do I look at this issue through Jewish eyes? And particularly, in our case, how do I address the various and sundry arguments pro, against any issue from within the Jewish text? It has so much to teach us, and we get to learn some really good text tonight. So in that spirit of this being a safe space, of us wanting to learn together, let's have a wonderful evening, and hopefully you'll leave. Our objective is for you to leave knowing something that you didn't know when you came in about the Jewish perspective, not just on abortion, but on individual rights, and who ultimately has authority over Steve Kahn's body. Well, I don't know if that's in the text, per se, but who has authority over my body, my decisions? We've had a lot of good conversations during COVID about that, by the way, when it came to vaccines. So we're not going there, though. Rabbi Mason-Barkin, it's all you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Todd.
You're welcome.
Stephanie, are we all good? Well, hello, everyone. It's so good to see our sanctuary full with many, many members of our CBI community and many, many guests as well. Those of you who are here perhaps for the first time or the first time in a long time, welcome to our sacred space, whether it's our sacred in-person space or our sacred online space. We are so glad that you've decided to join us for this important conversation. It is my honor and my delight to introduce you to my dear friend, Rabbi Emily Langowitz. Rabbi Langowitz was ordained from HUCJIR in New York in 2017, where she wrote a rabbinic thesis entitled, "In Our Bodies to Do It, a Progressive Jewish Theology of Reproductive Choice." And this thesis also is featured in part as an article in the Reform Social Justice Torah commentary. Is that correct? Yes, so if you Google what does Judaism believe about abortion or what does Judaism believe about reproductive rights or reproductive justice, Rabbi Langowitz is one of the many voices that you will find when you look for what authoritative Jewish voices are saying today about this important and pertinent topic. So many of you either know Rabbi Langowitz from or met Rabbi Langowitz when she was the assistant rabbi at Temple Solel from 2017 to 2020. So you are truly one of us. You understand the Arizona Jewish community, you know many people in the Arizona Jewish community, and you are a part of our Arizona Jewish community. So we are so glad that your voice is one that is represented by us too. So we are really glad that you're here. And currently Rabbi Langowitz serves as the Jewish Engagement and Learning Manager at the URJ. Here's a plug for our upcoming Introduction to Judaism class, which we'll be teaching in the fall, combined project of Congregation Beth Israel, Temple Solel, Temple Kol Ami, and Temple Chai. And Rabbi Langowitz is the one on the URJ end who helps us coordinate and communicate introduction to learning about Judaism, opportunities to everybody out there. So Rabbi Langowitz, we're really glad you're here, not just because we love you, but also because you have this really important set of texts and learning to teach us, and we can't wait to learn from you. So thank you for sharing, and welcome to Torah for Our Times. Yay.
Thank you to both of the rabbis of Congregation Beth Israel. It's lovely to be invited to be back in this space, which I was in every so often for a joint Yisker service or two. So it's nice to see everyone, and I appreciate you all coming out to talk about a topic that is not only a place of sort of personal intellectual expertise for me, but also something that is very dear to my heart in terms of teaching about it and learning about it with others. So as Rabbi Kahn said, there's a lot in here. We might not get to all of it, but I want you to at least see it. Before we dive into these texts, I want to offer a few caveats. The first is a little bit of an exercise, so I'll just invite you to think for a moment about how many women you know. Just ballpark. How many do you know? It's probably a lot, right? So you might even think, well, how many women do I really care about? Friends, family, people I love, or people I work with. And then I want you to divide that number by 4. And statistically, that is the number of people you know who have had an abortion. Now, you might not say to yourself, well, wait, I got this number. I don't think that many people I know had an abortion. Possibly not. It's statistics, right? We have no guarantee. But it's probably close. And so I just want to put that out there from the beginning to remind us that we're not talking about an abstract concept. We're not talking about something that only lives on a debate stage. We're talking about people's lives, and not just people out there's lives, but the lives of people you know. So I just want to remind you of that as we go into this conversation. That colors how I do everything that I do, and it also, I hope, will color how you respond to these texts and how you grapple with them. I also want to put out there that these texts that we're looking at, not all of them understand the concept of abortion in the way that we do in modern times. This makes sense, right? There were no refrigerators or cars in the Torah when they started talking about the rules of Shabbat. And so eventually we had to go back and say, okay, well, what can we pull on that seems similar? Lighting a fire, is that like electricity? How does this work, right? So this is the same concept we're gonna have to bring to these texts. These are texts that talk about certain issues in the reproductive life cycle that might help us come close to an understanding of what Judaism can offer us in how we think about abortion. But we just have to keep in mind where they live and where they are in their time, that they're not talking specifically about what you and I understand today. And finally, I just want to note that I am a Reformed Jew, and I would assume if you are members of this congregation, or you might also identify yourselves as Reformed Jews. And so we're going to be looking at texts that come from, specific halakhic interpretations of Judaism, but I'm going to bring to that the lens of sort of just a critical understanding eye of where does this text come from, what is its context, what is it telling me, and use my lens as a Reformed Jew to say, okay, does this feel authoritative and binding to me, or does it feel like an interesting thing to think about, but not something that speaks to me on an ethical, moral level? That's the project of Reformed Judaism, so I just want to own that up front, that that's how I come to some of these texts. Okay, we're going to dive in. So on the first page, I've brought you here at the top, this is the quintessential text from Torah that Jewish sources will point to when we talk about abortion. And the text comes within the portion of Mishpatim in Exodus, which is a whole litany of all sorts of different laws about how society ought to operate. If your donkey gets in a fight with my donkey and something happens, who owes who what, right? It's those kinds of laws. And stuck in the middle there is this portion, which I'll read to you in the English, but I've provided the Hebrew for you as well. And I'll just point out a few times when translation becomes challenging and we have to sort of look to the Hebrew for a moment. So this is Exodus 21, verses 22 to 23. When men fight, and one of them pushes a pregnant woman, and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues. And the Hebrew here is ason. An ason is a tragedy, some kind of horrible thing occurs. And the general understanding within Jewish interpretive work around this text is that no other damage ensuing, and ason would mean that the woman herself dies. So if there's a miscarriage, but the woman doesn't die, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. So what do we get from this first part of this text? We understand that if there is a miscarriage, when a woman is accidentally pushed somewhere in the public sphere, that the person who pushed her is responsible for a monetary fine. This is some kind of monetary damages for the loss of the fetus. And then it says, but if other damage ensues, meaning there is an ason, there's a tragedy, meaning the woman also dies, then what is the penalty? The penalty shall be nefesh tachat nafesh, life for life. So we're seeing in this text that there is a status differential in Jewish case law between the fetus while in the womb and the loss of a fetus while in the womb, and the woman herself who's carrying the fetus. In one situation, if there's a miscarriage, there's a monetary fine. In the second situation, if the woman herself dies, the text tells us that's a capital crime, nefesh tachat nafesh. So that piece about being a nefesh is going to be the thread that gets picked up. This question of what is the status? What is the status of the person carrying the pregnancy versus the status of the pregnancy itself? And all of that is grounded in this first text from Exodus. And it's very clear here that there's some kind of status differential. The fetus does not yet have the status of nefesh, of a full living being, because otherwise the penalty would be the same as for the death of the woman. Okay? Now that's sort of our starting Torah text. You'll see in a couple other places I'm going to bring Torah back in, but this is where a lot of the conversations begin. So then we turn from Torah to our rabbinic texts. We're going to look a little bit at the Mishnah and at the Talmud. These are texts that were developed after the destruction of the temple. We're reimagining what Judaism can be without being a sacrificial religion. And we're starting to put together rabbinic Judaism, which is what we've inherited as our Judaism. And here are a few texts from within that canon that show up, and the Mishnah, think about the first couple of centuries of the Common Era, that show up and give us a little more about what happens, what we think about the status of a fetus and a woman. What happens? How do we think about that status? And some of these texts are graphic, by the way. The rabbis are down to talk about anything. So they say in the Mishnah Ohalot, this is 7:6, that if a woman is having difficulty in childbirth, right? This is all the way up to childbirth, one cuts up the fetus inside her and takes it out limb by limb, for her life comes before its life. So up until the moment of childbirth, this is possible. If there's a difficulty in childbirth, you can sacrifice the fetus for the life of the mother. Then it says, if most of it had come out, and it's interesting, there's actually variant texts. This one says most of it. Some of them say if the head comes out. So they knew what a breech birth was, which is really interesting. Is it the head? Is it most of it? How do we decide? If most of it has come out, one does not touch it. And then in the Hebrew here it says, she'ein dochin nefesh mipnei nefesh, for one does not push off one life for another. So what is this text telling us in very graphic terms? They're saying the status of nefesh is not conferred to the fetus until the fetus comes out of the womb. That up until that point, it would be acceptable to sacrifice the fetus for the life of the mother. But at that point, they gain the same status. And suddenly, we can't decide between the two of them. If, for example, Rabbi Kahn and I were lost in the desert, and you had one thing of water to give to us, and you had to decide, who am I going to save, Rabbi Langowitz or Rabbi Kahn? Don't say the answer out loud. Don't yell it. The answer is you can't choose between the two of us, right? Because we both have the status of nefesh. So we can't decide, oh, I'm gonna, choose Rabbi Kahn, I'm gonna kill Rabbi Langowitz so that Rabbi Kahn may live with the final thing of water, right? So it's the same principle here. As soon as the baby emerges from the womb, it gains the status of a nefesh, of a full-fledged life. And note that it's a different word than the word we see in the first part where it says her life comes before its life. That's chaim. Chaim, like l'chaim. That's her life, right? Her day-to-day living. This is a different, we use the same translation, but it's a different word in Hebrew, nefesh. It connotes something deeper than just, how's your life going, right? It connotes something deeper, which is the status of full personhood, right? Okay, we're going through a lot of text because we're going to leave the questions for the end. So if your mind is working and turning and you have questions, write them down on the side of your paper or hold them because I want to hear them for sure. Okay, then we come to the next stage of this debate, which is this question about nefesh versus not nefesh, is that the only thing that's going to guide us in how we think about these questions? The answer is no, because of course, it's a lot of Jews, they all have a lot of thoughts. So this comes from the Talmud. This is a passage in the Talmud in Sanhedrin 72b. Rav Huna said, a minor in pursuit. I'm going to translate that in Hebrew. In pursuit is a rodef, somebody who's running after you to try and kill you. That's a rodef, someone who's coming after you. They may be slain to save the pursued. So if Rabbi Kahn and I are just hanging out in the desert and we need water, that's one thing. But if I've got a coconut that I'm about to smash over his head, he can kill me in self-defense, right? I would be a rodef in that situation. We're not going to sleep well tonight, Rabbi Kahn, worrying about being stuck in the desert together. Yeah, so they're going to go on and talk about, okay, well, what does that mean? The pursuer, should they be formally warned? Meaning you should say to them, you're coming after me to kill me, I got to kill you first. They're having a discussion about that. But then they realize, this topic might be relevant to something else. So Rabbi Chisda asked Rav Huna, we learned, once his head has come forth, they're quoting this Mishnah we just read, he may not be harmed, because one life may not be taken to save another. And he's saying, but wait a minute, isn't at that moment the mother's life still at stake? Is not the baby in that moment still a rodef, another person pursuing you to the point that they might kill you? Is he not a pursuer? And the anonymous voice of the Talmud here says, well, there it's different, for she is pursued by heaven. They're saying, I don't know that you would give a baby the status of a rodef. It's not like they're thinking to themselves, ooh, got to get this mom of mine, right? It's something, what they mean is not that God is making it happen, but that this is one of the ways of the world. This is something that happens to us, that sometimes mothers die in childbirth. And if you think about when this was written, that was a very prevalent thing that would happen, right? Sometimes it just happens this way, and there's nothing we can do. So we're not going to talk about, are they pursuing her or not pursuing her? This is how it happens, right? Childbirth is dangerous, especially at the time of the Talmud, 4th, 5th century. But there's a couple of really interesting commentary that develops in medieval times around this concept of a nefesh, a full-fledged being, versus a rodef, a pursuer. And Rashi and Rambam write two different things about this text that will go on to kind of shape the threads of where Judaism comes down on abortion. You'll see more lenient positions, and they're going to derive their thoughts primarily from Rashi's commentary here. And you see more stringent positions, and they're going to derive their thoughts from Rambam's Mishnah Torah. And we'll see why that occurs. So Rashi is commenting on this piece. His head has come forth. And he said, oh yes, this is that situation we've heard about, a woman that has experienced difficulty giving birth and is in danger. And he's reminding us of the first part of that Mishnah. It's taught in the first section of this teaching. The midwife extends her hand and cuts it up and extracts. And he says, as the entire time that it has not gone out into the air of the world, it is not considered a soul, a nefesh. And so it is possible to kill it and to save its mother. So Rashi's commentary is cementing what we see in the Mishnah. The question is it a nefesh? And he's saying up until you emerge from the womb, you have a different status, and therefore it's acceptable to save the mother for that reason. Rambam takes a little bit of a different turn, and this is the Mishnah Torah, and you can turn to your second page. And this is what Rambam says. He says, a pregnant woman who experiences difficulty giving birth, it is permissible to cut the fetus in her womb, either by drugs or by hand, because, why? Not because what Rashi says, which is it's not yet a nefesh, but because it is rodef. It is like a pursuer after her to kill her. So think about what that distinction sets up. In Rashi's opinion, as long as you're not a nefesh, it's okay to sacrifice the fetus for the benefit of the mother. And therefore, we can derive more lenient positions because there are a whole host of reasons you might say, well, I need to terminate a pregnancy that may or may not have to do with your immediate mortal danger, right? So from there, we can derive some more lenient positions, and Jewish tradition will do so. What Rambam is saying in the Mishnah Torah is, no, it's not about whether or not it's a nefesh. It's about, is it like a rodef? Is it like a pursuer? And he says like, right? Because he knows, well, it's not, it happens. Is it like a pursuer? Well, to reach the status of a rodef, of a pursuer, that means a person needs to be in mortal danger in order to kill in self-defense. So Rambam becomes the grounding for more stringent positions, which say abortion is acceptable, but only in the cases where a fetus would act like a rodef, where it could cause mortal danger to the mother, right? So do we see the distinction between those two threads? Great, beautiful. So that sort of sets up the longer conversation. I'm going to show you a few pieces of response that are interesting around that, but that gives you the grounding. Now I want to show you a few other things that are about just the status, how the Talmud, how rabbinic texts talk about the status of a fetus in general. And what are some other concepts that come into play that are not just nefesh rodef, nefesh rodef. So the first is from Mishnah Arachin, and another graphic one for you. If a woman is about to be executed, they do not wait until she gives birth. But if she had already sat on the birth stool, she's already in labor, then they wait until she gives birth. Now, the Talmud has an interesting discussion of this that helps us understand what they're thinking about when they think about the fetus in the woman's body. They say, isn't it obvious that the court executes the pregnant woman rather than waiting? After all, it is part of her body, meaning the fetus is part of the same death sentence that the woman has received. It's grotesque kind of talking about it in this way, but this is how they talk about it. And Rav Yehuda says, then they go on, that Shmuel says, in the case of a pregnant woman who's taken by the court to be executed, one, I apologize for this typo, one strikes her opposite the womb, hit her, so that the fetus dies first, so that she not suffer disgrace. So they're one-upping themselves. They're basically saying, don't just kill her. First, cause the miscarriage. Then you can execute the capital punishment. Why? So she doesn't suffer disgrace. What does that mean? They mean if she starts to go into labor while dying, that would be a disgrace of her dead body. That would be a defilement of her dead body. We know Judaism is very concerned about the sort of care and keeping of our bodies after we die. And I want to bring this to you just to remind us of what world they're writing in, right? And to think about the thing that is foremost in the mind of the authors of this text is not, wow, is it weird that we execute capital punishment in such a vicious way? Or I wonder what this woman is going through while she's awaiting her death, but also pregnant. They're concerned about her disgrace, but only when she's dead. And I think that's an important point to notice about who's writing these texts and where they're coming from, right? So that's one thing, and we also get the sense here that they are very clear about the fact that this is part of her body. This is not a separate entity from her. It's part of her body, right? Here are a few other sources that discuss that same kind of thing. I wrote various Talmudic sources because this is a principle that shows up in a lot of different places. The fetus is considered as the thigh of its mother, meaning, again, part of her body. And again, the context of those is interesting because a lot of it is not even about human fetuses. It's about cows, and if you're going to sacrifice a cow, but the cow is pregnant, and the pregnancy is not according to the purity laws, then can you really sacrifice the cow? There's a whole discussion. So that's where this kind of thought is coming from. Sometimes they talk about women. Can you if you're a daughter of a priest, can you eat of the sacrifice if you're pregnant with the child of someone who's not a priest? Does that invalidate your priestliness? And they say, well, it's as though it's the thigh of the mother, meaning she can still eat of the, right? But they're not talking about miscarriage. They're not talking about abortion. They're just sort of having logical, Jewish legal discussions, as the Talmud does. And another place where they do that, and Yevamot 69b is an example, if she is pregnant, until 40 days from conception, the fetus is merely water. That's another conception they have of this, that, this is not a full entity, right? This is something else up to that stage. Okay. So that's one thing for us to consider. Another thing to consider about the text, a lot of times people say to me, well, Rabbi, you just need to read the texts. You just have to be objective in your read of the text. You can't bring your own ideas and your thoughts into it. Just read the text as it comes, and it's objective, it's clear. So this is an example of where the text is extremely unclear, and the way that gets taken up in this discussion. And this is in the Talmud as well, in Sanhedrin 57b. The sages say in the name of Rabbi Ishmael, a descendant of Noah, meaning a non-Jew, is executed even for killing fetuses. The Gemara asks, what is the reason for the opinion of Rabbi Ishmael? Why would he say such a thing? And there are some Jews who believe if you have to have an abortion, you should try to go to a Jewish doctor because of this ruling that says if you're not Jewish, that would be a capital crime. But if you are, it's not. But I want you to see where it comes from. The Gemara answers, it's derived from that which is written, one who sheds the blood of a person, by a person his blood shall be shed. Genesis 9:6. This comes from Noah's story. And Rabbi Ishmael's interpretation of this verse hinges on where we put the comma in the verse. And if you've ever looked at a Torah scroll, there are no commas. So he's engaging in an act of interpretation based on the ambiguity of a verse from Genesis that he's using to bolster an argument that has nothing in particular to do with this verse of Genesis, right? And here's how it changes. If you read it as it's typically read, Shofech dam ha'adam, the one who sheds human blood, comma, ba'adam damo yishapech, by a human shall their blood be shed. It's that same thing, eye for an eye, life for a life, right? If you kill someone, you will deserve capital punishment. But Rabbi Ishmael moves the comma one word. He says, I'd prefer to read it this way, which is very, rabbinic of him. And he says, let's put the comma after the fourth word, shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam, the one who sheds the blood of a human in a human, comma, damo yishapech, their blood shall be shed. So because of the joy of the ambiguity of a punctuationless text and a language where certain prepositions mean multiple things, Rabbi Ishmael is able to derive this understanding that part of the Noahide covenant, the covenant made with non-Jews, is that they should not terminate pregnancies. They should not take the blood of a person in a person, is how he reads this. But I read it with the comma after the third word, and many, many, many people do. But there he comes into the Talmud, and there it gets codified. So I just want you to see that as well, to see all the ambiguity that comes into what we talk about. When we think Judaism says ... that's never a sentence I like to end, right? Because there are so many ways to interpret these texts. Okay, how am I doing on time, rabbis? Beautiful. Okay, so I want to show you a little bit around responsa literature, which is on the third page. Responsa literature was a type of literature that came into being when Jews were living in various communities in the Middle Ages, in pre-modern times, and someone would have a question, and they would write to a renowned rabbi. Maybe not in their own little community, they'd write to a renowned rabbi somewhere, and they'd ask their question. My wife won't go to the mikveh. She says it's okay to just sprinkle water in the outhouse. Is that good enough? That's an example of a great piece of responsa. So all sorts of different questions that would come up about how do I live Jewish life? What's permitted and what's not? So I brought you a few examples. These are from the 17th century and the 18th century, but there are some all the way through, even the 1990s, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A if you're curious. And I'm showing you, again, these examples so that you can see that the subjectivity that comes into how we make decisions according to Jewish law, even from people who are great renowned halachic sages and rabbis that you would write to for your authoritative opinion. So the first one here is from Rabbi Yair Chaim Bacharach, who was living in the 17th century primarily. Someone wrote him a question. What if a married woman gets pregnant by having an affair? Can she have an abortion? Regarding your question, he says, of a married woman who has become pregnant through adultery, and the question is whether she is permitted to swallow some medicine that will cause her to abort. So look how time has changed, the ways that childbirth is, and the act of bringing a child into the world. There are different technologies available now, right? He says, he has a long, long, long opinion, but here's part of his conclusion. Therefore, based on what we have written, it would be completely permissible in your case, according to Torah law. So he's saying, everything I've looked at, yes, she can have an abortion. And this is not for saving the life of the mother. This is not for saving, the child has some kind of genetic problem. This is not, the mother is in great danger. She had an affair and she got pregnant. The question is, can she have an abortion? And he says, I've looked at everything, I've written it all out. It would be completely permissible in your case, according to Torah law. But then he goes on. Were it not for the widespread practice among us and among them, who are them? The surrounding Christians, not to abort, because of a safeguard against fornicators and those who fornicate after them. What fun language our friend Rabbi Bacharach has. But what is he doing here? He's saying, I actually read all the texts, and the texts are permissive. Yes, you can have an abortion if you get pregnant by having sex with the wrong person. But I'm actually going to tell you no, because it'll make us look bad to our neighbors, and because I don't want you gallivanting about and fornicating, right? So I bring that to you because this is a legal decisor. This is the great sage of his time who people are sending questions to. And he reads all the halakha, and he says, the halakha says yes, but I say no. So this is another reminder when people say to me, well, wait a minute, you're just bringing your own ideas into it and you're basing it off of the morals of our times. So was this guy in the 17th century, right? That's how Jewish thought works. We are not objective creatures. We look at our sources, and then we look at our lives, and we look at the world around us, and we put those in conversation. And this is hundreds of years before Reform Judaism was an apple, a twinkle in the eye of a German man, right? And I want you to see that shows up today as well. This is a wonderful book by Dr. Ronit Irshai, Fertility and Jewish Law, but she too has her own subjective biases. She says, she's talking about abortion on demand, she calls it. I put it in quotes because I don't actually like that terminology. But she says, I would say a non-medically indicated abortion. That idea would have to be rejected, even if we were to find within the halakhic tradition interpretive possibilities that supported it. Why? You just told me, it's the same logic. Yes, I could find the texts to support it, but I don't want to support it, therefore I can't. So it's the same logic, which means it's very Jewish to look at our texts and then look at ourselves and look at our lives and look at what we believe and say, here's how I need to understand these texts. Here's how these texts can guide me, right? Everyone does it, not just Reform Jews. Here's another example. This is a responsum from Rabbi Jacob Emden, living a little bit later, more into the 18th century. And he is asked the same kind of question. What if a mother gets pregnant because of adultery? And it says fornication. Fornication, they mean inappropriate sex, as opposed to sex with your spouse. And he says, and I love it, now I love it because I don't want to hate it. Now it would seem to me that there is reason to be lenient since she has committed adultery. He's also saying yes. Why is he saying yes? Well, she's committed adultery, therefore she's now deserving of death, according to the Torah. Although her life is not in your hands to execute her, there's no longer a Sanhedrin, a great rabbinic court, so we're not going to actually exact capital punishment, but ideologically, we should. Nevertheless, by law of heaven, she is deserving of death. So now that the fetus is still a limb of its mother, and if her life were in our hands, we would execute her with the unborn child, it is obvious to me that there is no prohibition to destroying it, even if its mother remains alive. So what is he saying? She's already dead. Intellectually to us. She would have been condemned to death. And if that were true, the fetus too would be miscarried or die. And therefore, even though we're not going to kill her, we can abort the fetus. I just bring that to you again as an example of they're not reading these responsa questions and thinking like, what's going on in her life? What does her spouse think of all of this? Does she have family support? How is she feeling? Does she have a relationship to the potential life within her? They say, well, she's a fornicator, so we would have killed her anyway, so I suppose it's okay, right? So just to keep in mind when we look at these kinds of texts, there are certain voices speaking. And that is why I want to turn us quickly to the sort of final step of my work, which is it's important to me that I feel an expertise in all of these texts so that I can say to someone, this is where the conversation goes. This is what Judaism has said over time about this topic. But to me, that's not enough. And I'm guided by this quote from Rachel Adler, who is a professor at HUC. And she says, she's talking about the whole system of looking to these texts for answers. She says, to argue that the system requires no system critique, a liberal halachist must ignore or discount that halachic rules, categories, and precedents were constructed and applied without the participation of women, that they reflect perceptions of women as a commodified subclass, and that they are often inadequate or inimical to concerns that women themselves possibly would raise if they were legal subjects rather than legal objects. And this is key to me, because I care deeply about Judaism and what its traditions and what its texts have to say, but I also care deeply about people's lives, and that voices that have been excluded from those conversations within Judaism deserve to be a part of it. So on the last page, I've provided some contemporary work that I want to point you to for folks who are bringing new ideas about how we think about this topic, that it's not just about what's the status differential between the carrier of the potential life and the potential life, right? And sometimes they'll talk about even if a woman dies but the fetus is not yet dead, can we intervene on Shabbat, cut her open and save the fetus? And the way they talk about it is she's like a box. So ask yourself, would you open a box, right? This is a person who just died, right? So just think about that. That's the categories that live in these texts. So here are some other texts we might think about. This first one is Greenberg. She wrote this article in 1976, and she's an Orthodox feminist thinker. And I love what she says for a few reasons. One is this first piece she writes. She says, emotionally, theologically, as a Jew, and most of all as a mother who is daily nurtured by the sights and sounds of her children, I am opposed to abortion. So she says personally, this is not something I approve of, but I'm still going to think about how to look to Judaism to guide me in understanding what that means for the people around me. So though she is bringing that caveat at the beginning, she then does this beautiful thing. Here's what she writes. When conditions do exist, such as the need to support self and or husband through school, the need for time for a marriage to stabilize, overwhelming responsibilities to other children, and so forth, right? These are all reasons that sometimes we don't talk about because we feel like, oh, we should only talk about the life of the mother is at stake, or only talk about the fetus is incompatible with life, medically necessary issues, but we feel uncomfortable with those other issues. Greenberg is saying, those are legitimate issues. I'm gonna enumerate them for you. Time for a marriage to stabilize, overwhelming responsibilities. What does she say about those conditions? She says, then abortion should be seen as a necessity rather than an evil. Many mitzvot, commandments, are interdependent functions of timing and of the conditions which they regulate. So this is radical, what she's saying, for a couple reasons. She's basically saying, you wouldn't light Shabbat candles on a Wednesday night. Why would you have a child at the inappropriate time for your life, right? That's what she's saying. And what's radical about it,
People at home are having a hard time because the owl, the overpriced piece of garbage technology, is not working. And this is also a message that these things need to be in person. So, right? So I think if you mute and I unmute. Okay, now let's unmute. We have to turn that off.
Noah,
or
I
all the way
want
down.
you to build an ark.
We actually don't need that anymore.
Are we good? No?
I think.
Want me to try again? Yeah? Okay. This is my really good stuff. Come on. Okay. So what's radical? Greenberg wanted like a drum roll about how radical she is. What's radical about what she's saying is two things. One, she's saying that women are obligated to the mitzvah of childbirth. And Jewish tradition, actually, the first mitzvah in the entire Torah is pru urvu, be fruitful and multiply. And Jewish tradition actually says women are not obligated to that commandment. Only men are obligated to that commandment, which is kind of wacky because you need two to tango. But and the reason, if you look at the text below that I brought, this is from the Meshech Chochmah, and it articulates this beautifully. It says, it is not far-fetched to say that the reason the Torah exempted women from the mitzvah of be fruitful and multiply and obligated only men is because the laws of God and God's ways are pleasant and all God's paths peaceful. They're quoting Proverbs. And God did not amass on a Jewish person what the body cannot tolerate. Women endanger themselves in pregnancy and childbirth. That has been established as a legal principle. As a result, women are not commanded in the mitzvah of be fruitful and multiply. So Jewish tradition is very aware. I love this line. God did not amass on a Jewish person what the body cannot tolerate, right? God is not requiring of women to give birth against all odds. They know it's dangerous. It's asking a lot of people, and therefore you're not obligated to it, is what many texts will say, and this text in particular highlights. So Greenberg is saying, let's assume actually that women are obligated to that commandment. Maybe they're going to take ownership of that commandment, and therefore they get to choose when that commandment is acceptable. And the other radical thing she's doing is that women in Jewish tradition are not obligated to positive time-bound commandments, meaning a commandment that is a do, not a do not, right? I am obligated to the fact that I shouldn't kill anyone in this room, right? Whether or not it's time-bound. So a do commandment and a commandment that's predicated on a certain time, right? Women are not obligated to pray at a certain time. Women are not obligated to wear tefillin, to wear a talit, according to Jewish tradition, because they occur at specific times. And there was a concern. Women were too busy. They were taking care of children. You don't want to obligate them to throw on tefillin in the morning when they have other things to do. And Blue Greenberg is saying, no, let's obligate women. Let's give women the stature of a full-fledged Jewish person who is obligated to this type of commandment and therefore gets to choose how it takes place. And that's really radical, especially for a person who says, I don't actually believe in abortion, but here are all the reasons that one should have one, Jewishly, theologically, and in a far more expansive way than a lot of other texts will discuss it. Okay, last two things. One is a lovely article by Dr. Sandra Lubarsky, who writes about Judaism and the justification of abortion for non-medical reasons. This is an article from the 80s. And for me, this is such a beautiful encapsulation of the nuance of all of this. Because I know I hold a certain position, and every other person in this room might encounter these texts in different ways, and that's okay. And what she does so beautifully is to articulate the nuance of that, and to tell us that Judaism gives us permission to hold all of it. And here's what she says. Judaism can uphold such positions, and what positions is she talking about? The justification of abortion for reasons like Blue Greenberg offered. It's not the right time. I want to connect with my spouse. I have too many other children, all those reasons. Judaism can uphold such positions without denying either the tragedy of abortion, what might have been and was not, or the life-affirming aspects of abortion, what can be. So she is naming for us, I think a lot of the times we think about this debate and we think everyone has to feel a certain way. Abortion is always a tragedy. Abortion is always no big deal. And the truth is, nobody thinks about it that way. Anybody who terminates a pregnancy has had the thought process, what would it mean to carry this pregnancy to term? Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. If you don't think about it, how would you know what to decide? And she is holding the complexity of what that decision means, that it's possible to hold sadness for it, what might have been and was not, and it's also possible to hold the joy of it, what can be in my life because of the decision that's being made. So I'm not going to go through my entire thesis, but I will say that at the bottom I've listed some ideas, and I'm happy to talk about any of these in Q&A, for new questions and principles to consider. As part of my thesis, I interviewed Jewish people who had had abortions or were abortion providers about their experiences, and specifically about how they thought about their experience Jewishly, if they did at all. And from those discussions, I pulled different themes that came up frequently for people, that they said, this is how I felt, but I don't know if I could articulate it as being a Jewish value. And to me, it is a Jewish value. They're thinking about it, they're Jews, they're trying to integrate that into their moral decision making. How can we articulate that better for them? And so I came up with 5 principles that expand our discussion beyond just this very rigid, well, what's the status of this and what's the status of that and what's enough of a reason. And my hope is to move this discussion. Rebecca Todd Peters is a reverend who wrote a beautiful book called Trust Women about sort of the Christian perspective on all of this. And she defines it as moving from a justification paradigm to a justice paradigm. That this is not just about new, this is when you can. That these small, we have to justify what's acceptable, but it's about justice, hearing the voices and experiences of people who actually go through it, and thinking about how that can be in conversation with our sacred texts in a more expansive way. So these are the examples of that. I'm happy to talk more about them, but I also want to leave time for Q&A for everything I've covered, and I also know I've been talking at you a lot. So, I want to thank you for this sort of magic school bus tour through all of these texts, and I'm happy to take questions about anything that we've covered, or questions about some of the ideas that I've put at the end.
What we'd like to do, actually, first of all, thank you. That was you did 2,000 years in 45 minutes, more than 2,000 years in 45 minutes, and I think we can all agree that not only do you know your stuff, but that you speak about it both as a rabbi and a scholar in such a way that makes it very accessible to those of us who aren't experts in Talmud or Talmudic practice. Rabbi Mason-Barkin and I wanted to maybe just be selfish and start off with our own questions, and then we're going to do a combination of going around and hopefully now the Zoom is working better for people who are online. I know some people left and probably went to YouTube. Is the live chat on for YouTube? So I'll come over for people who are on YouTube. Feel free to ask a question in the comment section below. I want to remind everyone, including our rabbis, well, except for our rabbis, that a question is a sentence with a question mark at the end of it. It's not a statement, it's not a diatribe, it's not a presentation in and of itself. It's a sentence with a question mark at the end. So if we can do questions, that would be great, especially for those of you who are here and used to Torah study, where our questions can become multifaceted and very complex. So, having said that, we're now going to violate that rule and probably make some sort of statement with a question attached to it. But if everyone else could do that, then we can get all your questions in. And then you'll be around afterwards, I'm sure, for some other Q&A. So, Rabbi Mason-Barkin, you're up first.
Hi, Rabbi.
Hello, Rabbi.
So something that struck me, and I just would love to hear your response to. So many of the texts that we use to understand the kind of ancient Jewish perspective on when life begins come from a deeply misogynistic place. Like, for example, the one about, well, if she's committed adultery, then she's already dead, right? No one's saying that about men who commit adultery, I don't know. But I'm wondering what it's like for you when part of what you are teaching is about respect for women's bodies and how we do need to see women as equal partners in understanding all of these complicated topics. What is it like for you to rely on these texts that also kind of make our stomachs turn?
A great question. So a couple of things. One, I'll say I like to use the terminology when personhood begins rather than when life begins, because Dr. Willie Parker, who is himself an abortion provider and also deeply religious Christian, wrote a wonderful book in which I just think he expresses this so succinctly. He says, the wart on your foot is life. Like, there's cells in there, and you go to the doctor, they freeze it off, and off you go. We don't have any debates about that. So it's important to understand what we're actually talking about. We're not talking about when life begins. My cousin is a dermatologist. I have this tiny little thing, and I always say, is that something I should get checked out? And she always goes, you can keep it. You can keep it, right? It's just cells. It's life, part of my body, right? So when personhood begins is an interesting question.
That's a good point, and I'll use that from now on.
Yeah, thank you. And in terms of how I deal with these texts, I hope you saw, I try to find it funny. Like, I think that helps me when something just feels deeply like, oh boy, you really went there. Women's bodies are like a box, right? I think I try to be entertained by it. I try to sort of gently understand that the people who are writing what they're writing are writing from their own time and perspective. But part of the reason that the work I do is so important to me is that there were undoubtedly people at the time that these texts were written who were going through these experiences and whose voices weren't captured. And the great tragedy of history to me is that there's no way to recover that. We don't get to go back in time and find it. And so part of the tikkun of all of that, part of the repair for me, is doing this kind of work and saying, okay, we can see where the silences are in these texts. We can see one perspective that we're being granted that is sometimes permissive and sometimes not, and sometimes in language we enjoy and sometimes not. Okay, now that I know that, what can we add to that? How do we see our own voices and our own lives as authoritative? Because to me, it's not like someone put a rubber stamp at some point in Jewish history and said, this is where all the good ideas lived and all the authority lived, and this is where all the bad stuff is, and there's no authority whatsoever. I think it's a continuing experience of revelation. And so to me, it's exciting sometimes to do this work to say, okay, how do we bring new voices in? And for me, that should be just as authoritative as these other texts, just as sacred as something where we say, oh, that's in the Torah. So.
Yeah, it reminds me, a couple weeks ago in Torah study, this was the year that we got to have Acharei Mot by itself, and we had a great conversation about the listing of illegal relationships, and everyone looked at it, of course, from a modern perspective. And I think we agree in consensus, at Torah study at least, that just because the Torah says it doesn't make it authoritative now. And let's try to understand it in the context in which it was written. And I think Rabbi Mason-Barkin really put her finger on one of the most difficult and I would say damaging parts of Judaism for me is not as much that Jewish tradition and Jewish law in particular was written by men, but that it was written by men for men. In other words, it really didn't consider, unless there was the sort of rabbinic apologetic of, well, the women are the center of the home, and they keep the home, and they're the more spiritual ones, which was sort of like a go-in-the-corner statement. So given that, and maybe not related, one of the concerns a lot of people are expressing today is let me put it this way. In Jewish law, we have, in rabbinic school at least, they taught us about hermeneutics, sort of the ground rules for how we engage in not just the study of Torah, but the coming to law. And we have one of those hermeneutics, one of the ground rules is called a kal v'chomer. So if it says this over here, then it must be even more applicable over here. And I know that one of the issues that we're discussing today is sort of an American kal v'chomer. If a majority opinion of a Supreme Court says X, then it must apply even more so in some cases to these other issues. For example, things like birth control, things like morning after pills, things like, and I don't even know if that's the way that we refer to those pills, although I thought it was fascinating that the rabbi in the responsa literally talks about she takes a pill or medicine. And I think most of the people that I have counseled through abortion have been those who have taken the morning after medicine. How do you see this idea of kal v'chomer playing out potentially? And then as Jews, how do we identify that as a very, on the one hand, Jewish thing to take one piece of law and apply it over here, but at what point do we not do that, or do we see that as harmful? And just, it's a very long question.
Yeah, well, and look, I'm not a constitutional legal scholar. My wife is in the third row, and you can direct any questions to her. She's a lawyer. But what I'll say is another part of why this work is important to me is though we live in a country that enshrines the separation of religion and state, at times we find that a certain set of religious ideas filter into the way that governmental decisions are made. And people begin to believe that the only religious voice is a certain voice, that the religious voice is monolithic. For example, I saw a statistic once that when news shows cover questions around birth control, they will interview 7 times more often a Catholic priest than an OBGYN. There's just like this thing of like, oh, the moral voice lies within religious authorities, and religious authorities have only one moral voice. So for me, part of this work that's so important is to remind people that religion and moral authority is not monolithic, it's multifaceted. And that, yes, there are certain religious voices that have a certain set of opinions about how various things should play out in our country, and that we have every right as Jews to make it clear that we might have a different set of opinions based on our religious texts. And by the way, I don't think any of those opinions should be the deciding factor in how we decide law in this country. That's why we have separation of church and state. But if there's going to be debate in the public square around the moral voice on certain issues, then we should be, as Jews, also a part of that debate. And that's, part of why this work feels very important to me.
Right. And I agree. I think the Establishment Clause is one of the most important aspects of constitutional law. And at the same time, depending on who decides what the Establishment Clause means at any given time, we can get into a lot of trouble and go down these paths that are probably not good for the Republic. I'm going to take the other microphone, and I will first open the floor here for some questions, and unless there are some follow-ups that we have, but I know that we want to end by 8:30, and we're respectful of your time and everyone online's time. So I'm going to start here and kind of move my way around. If someone asks the question that you had intended to ask, by all means, feel free to take a pass. So Mark, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your commentary. It was very interesting. We're Reformed Jews, and you're talking about the Torah and, of course, those who are making commentary. But in our community, in our country, in our world, we have Orthodox Jews and other labels. And oftentimes, we view that as, well, they think differently, more conservatively, more liberal, but we're Reformed Jews. How do you think about all that?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, a statistic that I love is that the Pew Institute, that does a lot of sort of survey work on American religion, did a survey in 2014 about American religious views on abortion. And they asked the question, do you agree with the statement that abortion should be legal in all or most cases? And of all the groups out there, all the different religious denominations, Jews, and it was not divided by denomination, American Jews, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, just Jewish, whatever, 83% of them believe that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. So that can't just be us, because we're not 83% of American Jews. And that is, by the way, more than any other religious group, including, the second one is Buddhists at 82, including 73% of non-religious Americans believe abortion should be legal in all or most cases. So there's something about Judaism that it is the religious group that most believes that abortion should be legalized in our country. And of course, if you ask an Orthodox rabbi to listen to what I just said today, there will be things where he'll say, yes, I agree with how she parsed that text. And there will be things where he might say, I don't really agree with the way you interpreted that. And within Orthodoxy, there's a plethora of opinions. So many people within the Orthodox community look at that piece about the difference between sort of pre-quickening fetus and a not, even embryo stage, and say you have until 40 days or 3 months. They'll push it out to 3 months. So for many Orthodox Jews, that's kind of the borderline. And by the way, that's the 98% of abortions that take place in the United States take place in the first trimester. So that encompasses pretty much all abortions in the US. But there are many, I read a responsa when I was preparing for this that I didn't have time to include by a very noted Orthodox authority written in 1995, and the question was, now that we have the scientific capacity to diagnose Tay-Sachs in the womb, is it acceptable to abort a fetus with Tay-Sachs? And the whole issue was that can't be diagnosed until second trimester, so what do? You have to wait. And he said, you can wait, and in fact, you could abort a fetus with Tay-Sachs, according to this Orthodox rabbi's opinion, up to the end of the 7th month of pregnancy. So I think the same thing that I was saying to Rabbi Kahn, that we have maybe a false narrative about, certain religious groups are the only voice on religion and things in public life. I think the same thing is true for our narrative potentially about how Orthodox Jews make decisions and believe about things and what they say. I think any Orthodox rabbi you ask would say that abortion is not only permissible in the case of danger to the life of the mother, but necessary, required. And I think that's not just, Reform Jews are out here saying that. That's everybody. So I think there's something powerful about recognizing that this is a shared value within denominations in Judaism, even if we might disagree about when that value should appropriately be applied.
Thank you.
Rabbi, given what you just said about a shared value, do you think that's going to translate into political action, assuming that the Supreme Court opinion is going to be what we think it will be? Will there be anything URJ or even a consortium of the denominations within Judaism, anything that will translate to political activism?
Yeah, I think it already is. There's a Jewish rally for abortion justice, I want to say is the title, that's taking place next week in Washington. And I know that the sponsors of that rally are sort of across the Jewish denominations. So I think the work is already being done of Jews from sort of all sorts of different walks of Jewish life around making it clear that there's another religious voice out there. I think there's always more work to do, but I think it's already, the seeds are already being planted. And my hope is that we'll have sort of a broad coalition from within Jewish life that continues to do that work.
Rabbi Sharf.
Hi, Emily.
Hello, good to see you.
Yes, when Rabbi Linder was gone, when Emily was here, I was helping her out.
You were more than helping me out.
Doing a lot of visitations for her. So I want to know, and it's not in the religious aspect, but as a man, what is it? Yes, I support the right for abortion. I support my wife and her opinions as a woman. But what is it that we as men can do? I mean, yes, we can go to a rally, do those things, but is there something else that women would be looking, particularly in Judaism, and in maybe even in Reform Judaism as well, that men can do to help in support of this?
Yeah. It's a beautiful question. Thank you. I can't speak for all women, but I'll try to answer, which is, I think there's a lot that can be done for anyone. Yes, going to certain political activism, but donating funds to abortion funds, particularly, that help support people. One of the pieces of my thesis is talking about this, not just as a choice issue, but a justice issue, right? Who actually has access to these things? The truth is, my family lives in Massachusetts. If God forbid, I were to need an abortion in the state of Arizona and couldn't access it, I could take the time off work, I could get on a plane, I could stay with my family, I would have the money and the privilege and potential to do all of those things. And that's not the case for a lot of people. So I think financial support is actually really powerful right now, and the Abortion Fund of Arizona does beautiful work around that, along with the National Association of Abortion Funds. I think reminding, just as you notice people talking about this, since I know, it's always a present concern, but particularly right now, to be the voice that reminds people of the humanity of the people making these decisions, that it's not an abstract concept, that these are real people, and to remind people of that. And also, I think, part of the nuance we discussed is that though women and people with uteruses have a specific experience of what it is to terminate a pregnancy, sometimes we forget that their partners are also a part of that, and that they're going through emotions themselves, even if they're not going through that physically. So I think also to be someone who says, if you're a male partner of someone who has lost a pregnancy or chosen to terminate a pregnancy, and you're thinking about it, feeling about it, want a safe space to talk about it, to make it clear that you're someone who can do that, I think is powerful as well.
Thank you. Any questions?
I'll give it a stab. This might be a bit far afield, but how did it come to be that our Christian brothers and sisters have become such a large segment of them have ideologically and so vociferously opposed any abortion whatsoever, and have come to a diametrically opposite position than what is set forth in our ancient texts?
So I don't have a great answer in terms of contemporary political movements. I think there's things that we can learn about sort of the strategy of weaponizing abortion as a single issue in order to sort of win political ground. But I will say, in terms of a religious historical perspective, something very interesting happened when the Torah was translated into Greek, and it's called the Septuagint. And this is the text that many Christians would use to read the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And when they translate that passage from Exodus that I read, with the word ason, which I translated as tragedy, or the English here says no other damage, that when they translated that into Greek, rather than translating it in the meaning sense of the word, it got translated to a Greek word that sounds like ason and means in the image. Don't know why it happened, but that's why it happened, which meant that Christians reading this passage read it very differently. They did not read it as talking about the differential between a fetus and a parent. They read it as if the miscarriage occurred and the fetus was not in the image, meaning it had no form, it had no substance, versus if the fetus were in the image, had form or substance. So again, we talked about you move the comma one place, you get a whole different opinion. It's the same kind of thing in early Christianity. You translate a text in a specific way, and it completely changes the conversation. So I think early on, it became less about that question of the mother versus the fetus and more about, well, at what point, is the fetus in the image? And many Christians came to interpret that as meaning, well, we're all in the image of God, so that would happen as early as conception, right? So that's part of, I think, the history of it. And, also certain churches have, especially, for example, the Catholic Church, though there's a lovely group called Catholics for Choice. But certain churches have different structures than Jewish movements. So yes, I work for the URJ. I tell my Catholic in-laws, it's like I work for the Pope. But it's really not like I work for the Pope, right? It's much more diffuse in terms of the authority that we have. In fact, sometimes I think no one thinks we have any authority. But in certain Christian denominations, the structures of authority are much more rigid. and hierarchical. So that means that if people want to enshrine certain opinions about these kinds of ideas, they kind of get set in stone in a different way than they might in Judaism. So those are some thoughts.
I think it's also part of the problem of having binary choices or options, right? So we're a movement that has passionately, at least since the 70s, believed that interfaith couples, specifically the non-Jewish spouse, should be included in our congregations, on the bema, lighting candles. In other words, we are heretical when we say that to some other Jews. In other words, we should just be excommunicated for such ideas. As a movement, we were at the forefront of LGBT inclusion within the community. I was in the first rabbinic class in 1990 where openly gay rabbis were admitted. In other words, those who were before 1990 were in the closet. And so throughout time, there have been Orthodox authorities who look at it binary. You're either in or you're out, right? In the issue of interfaith. And on the issue of this, well, this is what Leviticus says. And we, as a movement, made a decision that is heretical to other Jews. And part of it is we don't care, or we find humor in these ancient texts sometimes and just have to take them maybe not so literally, but also figuratively. And I think you expose that in the responsa dealing with rabbis who said, look, this is what Judaism says. I happen to believe differently. Rabbis used to have authority over their communities. You would come for all of your legal decisions to me and Rabbi Mason-Barkin. Thank God that doesn't happen.
They didn't come to me then, Rabbi.
But we had authority for a long time, and now we don't. And the problem with that is that you get different authorities saying different things, and then it becomes very binary, and you have to pick a team.
Yeah, and I'll a couple comments on that to piggyback off of what you said. One is a biblical critic said a sacred text ceases to be sacred if it's used to harm. And I think that's a very powerful way of thinking about, the question you started with, Rabbi Mason-Barkin, about how do we deal with these kinds of texts. And the other thing I'll say is there are plenty of Christians out there who are very supportive of the, abortion access, of reproductive health and reproductive justice. When I was in rabbinical school, I worked as an intern at an interfaith organization that did just that work. And this is maybe also an answer to Rabbi Sharf's question as well of, what else can we do? Is that, especially in, in terms of how do we think about this as not just an issue of abortion, but a broader issue? In the 1990s, a group of Black women at a theological conference about reproductive rights came together and said, I don't think this is really expressing everything we want it to express, right? We're not just talking about white privileged women who can get on a plane to another state, and coined the term reproductive justice, which for them is about the manifold structures in society that allow people to choose when to have children, and when they choose to have children, how they grow up, help those children grow. And that sort of expands this issue much more broadly, because it's not just about abortion access. It's also about early child care. It's also about maternal health. It's about sex education. It's about access to contraceptives. It's about racial inequality. It's about climate change, right? All those things influence how we raise our children and whether we choose to raise children. So another possibility for the kind of work we can do around this issue is to remind people that people have already been doing the work, that there are great organizations out there that are doing that work, and that they're doing it with a broader lens than just, we need to talk about abortion, which I think is essential, and that's my specific expertise, but that, the reproductive justice movement is saying this is about much more than that, right?
So what I can't understand is why we can't modify abortion by recognizing viability at some point in the process. Certainly now, the third trimester, we have a viable human being. Many would say at some point in the second semester, that would also be true. And to me, this is the true definition of reproductive justice when you take into consideration
the human being. So my question is, can you help me understand or modify my misunderstanding?
Yeah, and tell me more about what you meant when you said, how do we modify abortion? Do you mean how do we read the texts in that way, or just help me understand your question?
Well, everyone's yelling, abortion, abortion. We have to, a woman has a right to choose. So we can have abortion from the minute of conception to, there was one politician that said, after the baby is even born, we can think about it then after we look at it and make it comfortable. So nobody says, but, maybe abortion is the first trimester. Maybe now laws are moving in that direction, but we don't talk about that. You've not mentioned once, I think, in this whole discussion of this concept now of modern science and viability.
Yeah.
And that's really, to me, disturbs me greatly. Number two, I think the polling that's come out that we've seen is certainly most Americans in polls have said abortion is fine in the first X number of days, or go back to that 40-day thing, but most Americans don't want abortion in the third trimester. Thank you.
And just, Rabbi, we have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to actually get one more question teed up, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah. So, a couple of things to think about. One is part of what's enshrined in Roe v. Wade is that the Supreme Court said we will sort of allow for abortion up to the point of viability, which these days I think people would place at around 24 weeks. You got maybe a 50-50 chance. So that's one thing to think about. So as I said to Rabbi Kahn, 98% of abortions happen in the first trimester. That's up to about 12 weeks. And so I think a lot of the times when the rhetoric sort of pushes us to, well, are people just going to kill babies while they're coming out of people? The reality is that that's not happening. That it's just those cases are sort of straw men for what the reality of abortion care actually is, and that in 98% of cases, it's happening in the first trimester. 2% of abortions happen in the second trimester. And in the rare cases where abortions happen, say post 20 weeks, for example, in Colorado, there's a clinic that helps folks. I did an abortion doula training at the clinic in Colorado, and the doctors there are the most humane, compassionate, beautiful people I've ever met. And the people who come to have abortions that late in their pregnancy are typically not people who intended to have abortions at all. And the reason that they are having abortion at that point in their pregnancy is either severe risk to maternal health or some kind of extremely devastating diagnosis and a child they don't want to bring into the world. So what concerns me is when we allow sort of the political rhetoric, which pushes us more and more to those later in pregnancy cases that are actually not the majority of abortion cases. And I fully believe that it's completely within anyone's right in this room to feel personally to themselves, I really would prefer that all abortions take place within X number of weeks. That's completely within your right. I don't believe it's in the right of the state to tell us that. And I also think something for us to remember is that gestational age is calculated backwards to the date of the pregnant person's last period. So when we talk about, X number of weeks, you have to imagine that that is sort of an infinitesimal amount of time in terms of the person who's actually aware of their pregnancy. So for example, when we say, 6 weeks, well, you had 6 weeks to get an abortion. Many people don't even know they're pregnant by 6 weeks because they haven't been sitting there going, I've been pregnant for 6 weeks. That's 6 weeks calculated to the date of their last, you could have a regular cycle that lasts 6 weeks.
2 weeks.
Exactly, from when you would expect, and I could get into not every woman has a 28-day cycle, right? So I think that's another thing for us to think about is we think about, oh, we're sort of putting numbers of weeks out there, and that feels like a lot of time to us, or it feels like something has been happening, or a certain knowledge or a certain capacity for decision making has occurred. And in many cases, that's really, it's not true. So those are some
And
thoughts.
it seems that some of the texts that you did cover revealed that tension. Example again with the responsa from the rabbi who said, but look, you can basically do this, but I don't agree with it. And that's tolerating ambiguity, tolerating that this is what the law says, this is what the tradition says, this is what I feel as a human being. By the way, that's also part of agency and being a good Reformed Jew, having autonomy in the way that you see the world through your particular Jewish eyes, and at the same time, accepting or at least integrating, and then tolerating if there's a distance between them, what Jewish tradition says, not in the abstract, but in the actual text, where even Greenberg, who's one of the most prolific and profound Jewish thinkers of modern time, as far as I'm concerned, states the obvious for her, which is, this is what this says, I don't agree with it necessarily, or I'm not pro-abortion, but at the end of the day, it's about something that is incredibly personal, individualized, and as you pointed out, is done with significant integrity. But again, when we next year look at other bioethical issues, which we're going to do, because I'm always fascinated by these, we'll look at when is the right time to pull the plug from someone who's on a ventilator, and that's what's keeping them alive. These are very similar questions to be asked. Rabbi, and then Lori, and then we are
Then we're done.
Done.
I just want to add, to my knowledge, I am probably the person in the room who was pregnant most recently. So most recently gone through maternal care. So just to shine a light on what that process is like when we're talking about timelines and viability. When you call the doctor and you say, I'm pregnant, I need to go to the doctor, they will not see you often until you are 8 weeks. That means 1 month since your last missed period, which means that if we are saying that abortions can happen in the first 6 weeks, that's probably before a doctor would even be willing to see you to confirm the pregnancy. Then at 20 weeks is when that's into your second trimester. At 20 weeks, you have the anatomy scan, which measures the baby's brain, measures the chambers of the baby's heart, measures the fetus, all of the parts that need to exist in order for that fetus to become a living, breathing human. At 20 weeks, that's when you find out if that pregnancy is truly a viable pregnancy and if that fetus is going to develop into a baby that will have a quality of life. And in most places, 22 weeks, maybe 23, is the last possible time when one is actually able to schedule an abortion. And I know this because of my work in counseling women who have had to make that terrible choice at 20 weeks because of their baby's diagnosis. So the question about abortions into the third trimester, this is something that would have to be nearly impossible to even find access to if there even was access to it. The way that the maternal care schedule is designed is to only enable access to abortion in places that do up until the point of viability. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. And I'll just add to that, I think it's important that we all educate ourselves on how the reproductive life cycle works, but I also think it's really important to educate yourself from good sources about what an abortion actually is. I think a lot of the times we sort of hear very graphic details, or we hear words thrown out, surgical abortion, what does that mean? I think it's, I really recommend sort of educating yourself from good sources about what an abortion procedure is actually like, because I think it's very sort of important to kind of know, if we're going to talk about it, what are we talking about? Yeah. I know there was another question back there. Yeah.
And then we will wrap it up.
So, do I have to push something?
No, you just have to hold it a little closer.
Okay. Hi, Rabbi. So
It's a very interesting topic that you've brought up, and I'm thinking about the fact that a lot of Torah study and the Torah readings and bringing a contemporary viewpoint has been very much part of our synagogue life and many other synagogues' life, and I'm looking to you perhaps to draw a correlation to looking at the Torah as a living and breathing document and not something that's fixed, and drawing a comparison to our Constitution, because I think that that's where there's been this divisiveness in looking at the Constitution as originalist scholars, that if it is not written in the exact words of that document, then those rights don't exist. And somewhere in there is no interpretation for a contemporary view. And I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, again, I'll say not a constitutional scholar, but I think your question sort of takes us full circle to Rabbi Mason-Barkin's original question, which is, how do you deal with texts that are sacred? And I would say the Constitution is a sacred text within the sort of religion of American civic life. How do you deal with texts that are sacred, that are written from a certain time and perspective? And because I'm not a constitutional scholar or a judge or a lawyer, I don't have to deal with that in my day-to-day life. I deal with the Torah, and I sort of shared how I deal with that. But it's certainly much less authoritative on my life than what's decided based on what's in the Constitution. And, you know, my personal feeling about it is similar to my personal feeling about how I access Jewish text, which is, if it's being used to harm, it's no longer a sacred text. And I know that there are people out there who feel very strongly that abortion is an act of harm. And I recognize that. I don't believe that. And it's important to me as a rabbi to say that I believe that abortion is a sacred act, actually. And so I think, you know, it's a whole other dimension of what it is to live in the world today, right? How do we deal with the way people interpret our founding documents? And I would just say, as a person who believes strongly in the ability to make tikkun, right, to amend, if you will, a text that has left me out, I think I feel similarly about the way we'd approach sort of constitutional law. But again, I'm not an expert in our legal system, so.
But I want to stop there, because the word tikkun, which we often use as part of the phrase tikkun olam, or the repairing of the world, and in the reform movement, I think we sort of own this idea of social action, which is now being taken in an entirely different direction by many. This word tikkun and this concept of tikkun is actually our theme for adult learning next year.
Well, there you go. There's a segue for you.
I'm so glad that you said that, because I want to just do a plug. Our theme for next year, for this entire year, starting late summer and going all the way through, now that the centennial will be winding down, is going to be tikkun. Following COVID, following this craziness going on in the world, and particularly because of the divisiveness that Lori just spoke about in our country, we want to approach these issues that are happening all around us, especially that divisiveness and the rancor and the anger and the black and white thinking. We want to approach it from a perspective of tikkun. So a lot of the themes and ideas and texts that we will be studying in the next year will be somehow related to the idea of tikkun, because our world needs tikkun, and as Jews, it's our obligation to help to heal the world. L'taken olam b'malchut Shaddai, as it says in the second paragraph of Aleinu, to repair the world, not just for God's dominion, but to bring God closer to earth. That's really what we want to study and learn about in the coming year. And every Shabbat morning, for Torah study, we have a mini version of this conversation based on that week's Torah portion. So I invite you to come join us online or in person for Torah study. It's one of our most favorite hours of the week, and I look forward to seeing you guys over the summer and in the coming year. Rabbi Langowitz, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stephanie, thank you as always. And to our tech staff, our tech team, I think we did the best we could with what we had.
I think we learned that I should not be the tech team.
Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Drive safe, please.